Hey, hey, it's another Domo Lunch and Learn, and I am joined by my good friend, Andrea Henderson. So excited to always have Andrea on. She has so much content to share and exciting things in Domo, and they're so hands-on and a little bit nerdy, which I love when Andrea is on. Obviously, today we're going to be talking about going from recursive to partitioned. It's a little bit of a hands-on for examples of converting existing magic flow. These things are way over my head, obviously. There are some things that I always, kind of needle around in Domo, find my way into breaking something eventually. But a lot of the stuff isn't as straightforward as we'd like it to be. And that's why we have people like Andrea who come on to the Lunch and Learn and live streams with us here at Domo to tell us all about how to convert some of these magic data flows in these partitioning betas. So excited to welcome her again. Her presentations are always insightful, and they always come with a little bit of humor, which I love when we do these on a Tuesday or Thursday. So appreciate you, Andrea, for jumping on and being with us on this Domo Lunch and Learn. Excited to get started here.
Great. Thanks, Eddie. Excellent. Okay, so talking about kind of where the rubber meets the road, actually converting some of these recursive data flows that you have into using the new partitioning beta. I talked to a lot of customers about partitioning beta. I've talked to you all about partitioning beta here. But there comes a point where you really want to dig in and get going with it. And that is often the point that I find customers kind of start to stumble a little bit because they think they understand the concept and then they go in to do it and they find themselves struggling. So I'm going to walk through a really hands-on example of how to do this. But first, I just want to talk about just a couple of things in theory. So first of all, why would you even necessarily want to move from a recursive data flow to a partitioned data flow? Anybody who's had a long-running recursive data flow or who's had to do any kind of data repair on a recursive data flow probably knows the answer here. But basically, recursive data flows can take a really long time to run because you are continuously reprocessing data that does not need to be reprocessed necessarily and that is just growing linearly over time. So moving from recursion to partitioning can reduce the end-to-end latency of your pipeline. It's a lot more efficient, it's more robust, error tolerant, it's easier to repair data when you have data issues, and this makes it more scalable in general. You can keep having those big output data sets that you need in order to drive your downstream visualizations without having to run this big bloated data flow every day just to add data to these data sets. What types of data flows are actually candidates for being converted, though? At this point, because Magic only has partitioning available so far and does not have upsert available yet, recursive data flows that are very reliant on that unique row-by-row identifier are not good candidates for conversion at this point, unless you can rethink the way that you're ingesting data a little bit, in which case you can even move some of those over to using partitioning. Ones that are a good fit, though, are cases in which, like, for example, your data has a curing period, like that social media data. With partitioning, you can just ingest the rolling 7 days, partition on date, rolling however many days, partition on date, and then have that either updated or appended to your output. Other good use case is daily snapshots. This one's a great use case. If you're currently creating a recursive data flow, if you have a data flow running every day that all it's doing is tacking the new day's data onto your output data set, you will be stunned at the speed you will find when you move from using a recursive data flow to do that to using partitioning to do that. And finally, data flows where you're doing some historical updates of data kind of at a day level. Those are great candidates for moving to a partitioned scheme. So, when I'm talking to customers about this, I'm always a little bit reminded of that scene in that show that we all like, where Moira and David are cooking Moira's supposed family recipe. And the recipe says to just fold in the cheese, which is something that neither of them knows how to do. And whenever I'm starting to talk to a customer, I always think of this scene in which the customer is like, "Okay, well, can you show me how to get this partitioned? Can you show me how to fold in the partitioning?" Luckily, in this case, unlike Moira, I do know how to fold in the partitioning, and while I cannot show you everything, I can show you one thing. So I will be able to show you this. Basic steps to converting a data flow that is recursive to a partition data flow. And I will show you an example of this, of how this exactly works. But a basic blueprint is the first thing you have to do is you have to get your output data sets partitioned. Because partitioning is a storage strategy, data that has already been stored in Domo in a non-partitioned form um, cannot be partitioned. It has to be restored with the partitions attached. That's probably the trickiest part of all this. There are multiple methods to do it. I will show you one of the methods and I will explain all the methods of how you can do this. After you get your output dataset partitioned, you need to revise your logic upstream to exclude any deduplication steps that you have built into your recursive data flow. You add in your partitioning logic and then you revise your input so that it is set to appropriately constraints based on the logic that is now in play downstream in your data flow. And then I would always recommend running this data flow alongside your existing recursive data flow for a couple of weeks just to verify that everything is as you expect it to be. So the question of the hour, okay, how do I get the output data set partitioned? There are kind of three schools of thought, and this is a wall of text here, don't read it. But basically, the preferred method and the one that I'm going to show you today is to revise your current magic data flow through a series of steps. You can also, so the pros to this are that you don't have to mess around with any scripting or tools, and your output data set ID remains the same. So if you have downstream processes built on it, if you have cards and things built on the output of this data set, you do not have to switch all of your cards over to a new data set ID. Cons, this is a little bit complicated. It's a little bit easy to mess up. It's potentially destructive to your current data. So you want to make sure that when you're doing it, you make a copy and test it out first. And then when you are making the actual changes to the actual data flow, that you are doing so very carefully. Other options, kind of call this one partition inception, I don't know. But basically, you run your magic flow through another magic flow in order to partition it, and then you use that new magic flow as your as you incorporate the logic from your data flow into this new data flow. The pros are you don't have to mess with any scripting. It's very, very easy. Cons are that the output data set ID does change. So you would have to change your downstream processes. If you don't have anything built on this stuff yet, this is probably the method that you would want to use. And then finally, if you're really comfortable with scripting, you're really familiar with our CLI tool, you might want to go ahead and use the CLI to perform this process. And you can kind of, in essence, do a version of what I'm going to show you how to do in Tool, in which you pull down all of your data, tag it with the partitions, then you re-upload with the partitions available to the same output data set. So there's a few different options. Um, the one that I'm going to show you today, though, is this first option in which you are revising your current magic flow. Before I move into the actual demo, just pausing here in case Eddie has received any questions. Sounds like not. Okay, great. So here I have a recursive data flow example. This is just, you might recognize this if you've built recursive data flows in the past. I am bringing in, both my data sets. This is the output data set brought in as an input. I'm doing my selection of the I'm doing my selection of the rows that I want to bring through. I'm doing my deduplication. This is very standard data flow pattern. So what I am going to do here, because I don't want to mess up my current production data flow, is I am going to create a copy of the data flow. So this is my new copy. I recommend you carefully rename the data flow outputs so that, or both the data flow and, the outputs, so that when you are testing, you can easily go back and delete anything and you're not mixing anything up. And then, you want to rename your output so that you know how to find it again later. Just updating with today's date. All right, so as this copy exists right now, it has not run. And so this output here has not been established as 0 rows. I'm going to save and run this. I want to set this to, um, sorry, I'm going to save and run this. I don't really care about the scheduling right now. I probably want to set it to manual or something, but it doesn't really matter in this use case. So saving and running. Once it's done running, this output here that has 0 rows right now um, will exist and will have all of the rows populated from the upstream data flow. Okay, so it's run. We have our output established. This is a step that you will only go through when you are creating a copy of the data flow that you want to convert, because you want to be able to test this out before you make the changes in your data flow. When you are ready to make the changes to your actual production data flow, you won't go through this process because this will already exist for you. You will already have your output established. So in this use case, I established my output. Now what I want to do is I want to, in this step, I basically want to blank out my output data set. This is a little bit scary because this destroys data as it exists in your output data set. So you want to make sure that everything that exists in
Hey,
this
Andrea, sorry. Are you showing your demo right now?
I think so.
Well, we can't see it. So we're still on the slide deck. So
Okay.
there we go. We did
Okay.
it.
I'm so
Daniel,
sorry.
our good friend Daniel, who always joins us on these lunch and learns and live streams live, which we appreciate. He wasn't seeing the live demo, should now be seeing it. So give us a thumbs up if that's the case. I appreciate it. Thanks, Andrea.
Great. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Okay. Glad we got that sorted out. Okay. So here, so basically what you want to do is you want to find a way to blank out the data that's in this output data set. The easiest way to do it is to apply a constraint within your data flow that basically filters out all of the data. So in this case, I'm going to add a constant. I'm going to add a column, just a text column that will add a column to every row in my data set that basically says filter me out. So I'm doing that, and then I am applying a filter to this. And my filter rule is going to say when filter me out. So I want everything when filtering out equals, and I'm just going to say, actually, hang on, sorry. I'm going to say a specific value y because it will never equal y because the whole thing equals x based on the constants I put in. And then attach it to the end. This, in essence, will take, without touching the dataset ID or the schema of this output dataset, this will now blank out any of the data that exists in the dataset. So it previously has 714 rows. When this finishes running, which it should do very shortly, we will see that the output dataset has 0 rows in it now. So I still have my data set, I have my schema, I have my data set ID, it's now blank. So then what I want to do is I need to get this data basically restored into that output data set, but with the partitions attached. So what I want to do is I want to remove all of my upstream logic here because I don't need any of this anymore, because in essence what I want to do is I want to be able to take the data set as it exists. Let's see. This is the one I want. Okay, so this is the data as it existed before I created this data flow here. And I want to hook it up to my output data set, but I want to add partitioning in. Let me see if I have the column that I want. I do not, so I have to add it. So I'm going to add my partition column to the data set. And I'm just going to take the date of the start time here as my partition column, hook it up to my output data set, and then I will choose partitioning and I will choose my partition column. So now when I run this data flow again, it's going to take the data as it existed before I'd linked it out. It's going to add a partition column to it, and it's going to write this out into this data set that already exists with the same data set ID but with partitions. This is a new thing that I have not messed with before. Save and run. Okay. So when this finishes running and finishes storing the output with partitions, we will be able to see on the output data set that we now have partitions defined on this data set. So it'll list out all the partitions that were just defined and just added to this data set. You'll see the completion date is right now. The partition names, differ based on what the start date was in the data set. So now you've got your data flow, you've got your data set, your output established with partitions attached. And sorry, I'm just going to go back to my original testing. Okay, great. Now, what you want to do is you want to revise this again. I'm actually going to keep this formula because I need to add this back in. I need to add partitions, but you basically want to be able to include upstream any logic that you had in your data flow except the recursion, because you're not bringing this back in again. Your output has been partitioned now. You do not need to bring it back in order to update or add data to it. So in this use case, I'm just going to bring in I think it's just the NOAA data set. Um, I'm just going to bring that back in. I didn't have any extra logic in it because this was a very simple example. But if you had extra upstream logic, you would think through adding in, if you had calculations or things, you would add them back in here within your data flow. But I'm adding my formula here. And now when I run my data flow again, each time this runs, it is going to act as a partitioned data flow. So anything that already exists for the partitions in the output will be updated. Anything that is new will be appended. And going forward, it will run in this manner. So you see here, the input was only the 156 rows because we did not bring back in the output. The output is only 156 rows because that is all that we processed in the data flow, but the output data set is still that bigger output data set. You just weren't reprocessing all that data again. So that's a basic example of how it works. It is a little bit confusing. I definitely recommend taking it slow, step by step. I can make this available to Eddie to post in the community pages. I do have a section in which I go through step by step screenshots of how you go through the process that I just went through. So if you are wanting to follow along on your own with your own data, you can do that. And that is what I have today, Eddie. Are there any questions?
We didn't have any questions come through the chat, which is always a good sign. And love that you're able to share those resources with us. So we will put a link to those resources directly in the community page that led you to this live stream, which we really appreciate you being a part of. And if there are no further questions, Andrea, until we see you again, I really appreciate, again, you doing this and those joining. We have some comments coming in. Here we go. Daniel would like to know, would it work to modify an existing recursive data flow, adding the partition column and partitioning, run once, and then modify the data flow before running again? Woo!
Mm.
That's a lot of modifying.
So I'm thinking the distinction in what you're saying here versus what I showed is that you're leaving the data in place that existed before you turned on the partitioning and started running it. What happens in that use case is that the data that already existed in the data set basically exists in its own unnamed amorphous partition, and you will end up with data duplication, because if you then run the data flow again and you have data sets or data that's partitioned but that is not part, I'm trying to think of how to say this. If you have data that you would necessarily expect maybe you would have updated with, but it exists within that block that has not been already stored as partitioned, it will be appended to the output in partitions, because the data that already exists is just this unnamed non-partition, basically.
Awesome. Daniel, hopefully that answers your question. If you have any more questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. Again, thanks everybody for joining. We continue to try to provide these. I know we've been hit or miss the last few weeks. We're trying to really focus heavily on some new initiatives that we're really excited to announce in the next couple of weeks. So as we get these topics and content pieces built out and put together, go to the community, check the community forums for events. That is where you will see all of this. Daniel says thank you as always. And again, thank you, Andrea, for joining us on another Domo Lunch and Learn. We'll see you guys on the next one.